अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम सलाम।
वालेकुम सलाम।
कैसे हैं फैसल?
बिल्कुल सही। नदीम साहब कैसे हैं आप? खैरियत से हैं?
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह।
माशाल्लाह आप तो चमक रहे
लाइट का कमाल है।
सर खालिद साहब 1 मिनट बाकी है, इंशाल्लाह 1 मिनट के बाद शुरू करते हैं। जी बिस्मिल्लाह कीजिए खालिद साहब। सर आपकी आवाज़ नहीं आ रही खालिद साहब।
I begin in the name of Allah, the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. Why should we feel good to be Muslims is a series of presentations which is an attempt to understand as to why, despite the fact that we were accidentally born Muslims, we still feel comfortable that our faith by birth is indeed the right faith. I have made 2 presentations as yet. In the first one, I mentioned the fact that the text of Quran, the Almighty's book, encourages the reader to question, to ponder, to think, to reflect, to critically appraise and examine what the Almighty has said, to come to the conclusion that the book is from God. And even if somebody doesn't do it, the very fact that there is so much of mention of use of intellect and questioning getting encouraged is a reason for us to feel good. And the more we reflect and ponder and ask questions and find good answers to them, the more we feel comfortable. I mentioned yesterday that another reason why it gives us a good reason to, a good feeling to be Muslims is that the message tells us about the purpose of life, which makes sense, which takes into consideration the entire life, which is a formula which is applicable to all humans. And honestly, there's no other solution to the puzzle of this life except the one that has been presented by the Almighty as the ultimate reason why we were created. And that too is something that makes us feel comfortable. Today, I am going to mention about the fact that this message that we are talking about is a message which, when we look at it, when we try to understand its contents, its text, we also feel comfortable that it is exactly the same message which was presented by its presenter, the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him. He presented God's message some 14.5 years ago. And standing here today, we feel confident that this is exactly the same message which he gave us. In other words, there have been no alterations, no editing, no changes that have been introduced in this text over the last 1400 plus years. That feeling is important in order for us to feel confident that this message is from God. Because Why would one be interested in a message which has been undergoing editing and changes? Because if a message is to be from God, it has to be with us in its pristine form, or else it's not worth consideration. And the fact of the matter is that that's how it is. That's exactly how it has been done in the case of the message of Islam. The message of Islam, the message brought by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, God's mercy be on him, is comprised of two components: the Quran and the Sunnah. The Almighty is mentioned in the Quran in verse 15, chapter Surah number 15, verse 9, Surah Al-Hijr, verse 9. It says, Inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun. Indeed, we are the ones who revealed this remembrance, reminder, and we will make sure that it remains fully preserved. It is protected. This mention is a promise from the Almighty, and this promise seems to have been completely fulfilled in that it was preserved in a way that today we know that all throughout the Muslim world, wherever we have the Quran read and understood, it's the very same text which was presented by the Prophet himself as God's message. This was possible. This miracle came about because there were two criteria that were satisfied simultaneously. On the one hand, there was this criterion of unanimity, ijma, wherein all Muslims of the first generation were in agreement about the fact that the Prophet left this world with a book which began from Al-Fatiha and ended with An-Nas, comprising of 114 surahs, and that's what the book of God is. This unanimity was transmitted to the next generation in a manner that there was no interruption, there were no alterations, there were no gaps. In other words, there was uninterrupted continuity called tawatur. So, on the one hand, the Quran satisfies the criterion of ijma, complete agreement, complete unanimity amongst the Muslims of the first generation, who were the ones who were the companions of the Prophet. And then the same agreement and got transmitted to the next generations in a manner that the flow has continued and there has been no gap whatsoever. That's what makes us feel comfortable that the text that we are reading today is the very same text that was presented by the Prophet, who claimed to be presenting the message of God and to be the representative of the Almighty. We do not find the same preservation being done in the case of the earlier books that are claimed to be the books of God. Not that they were any inferior, not that the Almighty had lesser interest in them, but simply because of the fact that in the case of the earlier books, there was no accompanying declaration that those books and those prophets who brought those books were the last prophets and the books were the last books. So the Almighty, in order for the freedom of action that He has allowed humans, He did not stop people, evil people, from going about changing the text if they wanted to. There were other reasons why the text got altered. It so happened that in some cases the entire text got disappeared because of some invaders conquering Jerusalem, for example, and ransacking the entire city, leaving no text of Torah available at all, and it was then reproduced to the memory of humans and etc. God did not intervene. As I said, not because He didn't care about Torah quite as much as He cared about the Quran, but simply because of the fact that the Quran was to be the very last textbook of the Almighty, and therefore it was important that the book be fully preserved. And that's what happened in the case of the Quran. We are informed about the fact that this book, even though we know that it was revealed in a different sequence, it was then rearranged and was presented in a completely, entirely different sequence later on. And this process was promised at the very beginning of the process of revelation in Surah Al-Qiyamah, chapter 75, verses 16 to 19, wherein the Prophet ﷺ was comforted by being informed that Inna alayna jam'ahu wa Qur'ana, it is our responsibility that we are going to collect this book and read it out. So فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ, when we read it out, you follow us in the reading. ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانًا, then it's going to be our obligation to also explain its contents. So at the very beginning of the process of revelation, this promise was given that the book is going to be arranged in a certain manner. It is going to be read out to the Prophet, and that's exactly what happened through Angel Jibreel alayhi salam. And the Quran now is in a certain sequence which we all know is a completely different sequence from the historical chronological order that it was revealed in. And yet the entire Muslim Ummah is completely unanimous in acknowledging that this particular sequence is what the Quran is, and is the only valid text for Muslims to take, to consider as God's book. This remarkable process of preservation that was witnessed in the case of the Quran, that gives us confidence that this book is the very same text as was presented by the Prophet. And by the way, obviously, it's an important thing to have with us in order for us to be able to present it to others, because we can very confidently tell people that you believe in it or not, but this is the text that was presented as God's book and should be taken as the text that needs to be critically examined to find out as to whether it presents itself as a book of God or not. The same is true. The same is what we find happening in the case of the other component of Islam, of God's message, which is the Sunnah, the religious practices of the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him. The Sunnah is the component, the part of our religion, which the Quran asked the Prophet to formally introduce to Muslims by adopting Sunnah himself. The Quran mentions it in chapter 16, Surah An-Nahl, verse 123, when it asks the Prophet, ثُمَّ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ, then we revealed upon you, أَنِ اتَّبِعْ مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا, that you follow the religion of Abraham, who was absolutely fully focused. That is, the Almighty asked the Prophet in the Meccan period that the religion that was followed by Ibrahim alayhi salam, is the religion that you are going to follow as well. Obviously, Ibrahim alayhi salam did not have Quran with him as the text of the Almighty. The Quran was revealed to the last prophet. However, the religion that Ibrahim alayhi salam was following were the religious practices of Salat, the formal prayer, Zakat, alms giving, fasting, Hajj, Umrah, etc. And these practices were therefore followed by the Prophet as well. And like in the case of the Quran, these religious practices were transmitted to this Ummah in a way that now we have Sunnah with us, which satisfies the conditions of unanimity, ijma, and uninterrupted continuity tawatur, like it has happened in the case of the Quran. Uh, like the Almighty revealed the Quran and the Prophet read it out to his companions, and all the companions, they knew that from A to Z, that's what the text of the Almighty is. Similarly, was the case with, let's say, for example, the formal prayer. The Prophet prayed 5 times a day with Muslims. His additional prayer of tahajjud was also part of his prayers that he used to say regularly. But for common Muslims, it were 5 prayers that he prayed regularly, and Muslims, they also prayed behind him. And this was a practice that continued till the very last day of his life. So when he left this world, the Muslims were praying 5 prayers. How were they praying? Exactly the same way as the Prophet was praying. And when the first generation of Muslims left this world, the second generation had already started praying. And that's how we have got our prayers, and we've got our zakat, our fasting, psalm, as well as other religious practices, which are called Sunnah. So, like in the case of the Quran, in the case of the Sunnah as well, uh, there is complete unanimity right from the beginning, and that unanimity, ijma, got transmitted to the next generations in the form of tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. When we read the Quran, we learn that the Quran itself is speaking about Sunnah, even though it's not giving us the details as to how that Sunnah is to be performed. So we feel confident, feel good about the fact that there is a very close, strong, active relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah, and they go hand in hand. For example, in Surah 4, chapter Surah Nisa, verse 103, the Almighty mentions that Inna salata kanat alal mu'minina kitabam mawquta. Indeed, the formal prayer has been made obligatory on believers in their appointed times. So there are definite timings of each prayer that we are supposed to be praying. What are those timings is not what the Quran mentions. The Quran makes a confident, clear statement that these timings have been made obligatory, even though it does not mention those timings, leaving the mention of those timings to Sunnah to accomplish. Likewise, in Surah An-Nur, Surah number 24, verse 58, the Almighty mentions the fact that there are certain durations in the day which are to be considered, uh, observed as periods of privacy, and nobody would be allowed to enter the rooms of others without seeking permission. And while mentioning these hours of privacy, the Almighty mentions in 2 of the 3 cases that it should not be done min qabli salat al-fajr, nor should it be done min ba'di salat al-isha, neither before the Fajr prayer nor after the Isha prayer, even though there is no mention whatsoever in the Quran as to what is Fajr prayer and what was Isha prayer. The Quran mentions these 2 prayers in a manner that they are known. Muslims know about them. Uh, and therefore, there is no reason, there is no need to tell them and inform them what these prayers are. So both Quran and Sunnah go hand in hand in a way that one complements the other and vice versa. We say our prayers regularly, and in our prayers, one of the important things that we do is that we recite the Quran. So Quran and Sunnah both have been given to us in a way that they are fully preserved. We can see that they were preserved. The entire Muslim Ummah is practicing them, is accepting and following both sources as as a part of God's message, and they are both the same all throughout the Muslim world. However, there is a third source as well, which is a natural source, which is the information about the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which was witnessed, observed by the companions, some of whom, not all, but some, chose to transmit this information to the next generation. Not the entire information. Obviously, nobody could have possibly noted down the entire life of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. People noticed, observed whatever they felt inclined to feel interested in transmitting to others, and that's what they did. And the next generation, the people who got this information from one or a few of the companions, they transmitted it to next generation until such time that in the 3rd century Hijrah, there were many people, many scholars who came up with the task of scrutinizing and finding out as to whether the information in circulation in the name of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, mentioning his name, is it reliable or not? So they presented their own works in the form of books of Hadith. These books are a very useful record of the Prophet's life, but they do neither satisfy the condition, the criterion of ijma, nor do they satisfy the condition of tawatur. So it's not that all information that we have has been given to us by all companions, nor is it that we find that this information was available to Muslims all throughout the Muslim history. In the first 2 centuries, it was available only to a few people, and then it came down in third generation to the rest of the Muslim Ummah. Indeed, it's a very useful piece of information. It's a very large reservoir of information which has to be put to use in order for us to know and learn about the details of the Prophet's life. But this is a secondary source. This source has to be seen strictly in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the 2 primary sources, completely reliable sources, and their reliability is based upon the fact that they both satisfy the twin criteria of unanimity, ijma, and uninterrupted continuity, tawatur. In the case of Hadith, we do feel good that there is information which claims to be originating from the Prophet, but it's an information which needs to be scrutinized. It has to be seen in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. And obviously, when this process is going to be undertaken, there are bound to be differences of opinion amongst people, amongst scholars, which is what is happening. There are different opinions regarding what is the true understanding about what the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said about a certain thing or did on a certain occasion. So, all in all, what we have with us is knowledge, information about our religion, which is completely reliable in 2 cases, and which is not quite as reliable in a 3rd case, which was a human effort, but it can also be understood and employed for the purpose of our understanding of religion if it's seen in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. That is also a good reason, this whole scenario, that the way the process and the sources of information that we've gotten from the Prophet have come down to us in a way that we feel good and comfortable that there haven't been any alterations and changes that have been introduced during these 1400 plus years. And that obviously is in itself something remarkable and a reason for Muslims to feel comfortable that the message that they have been provided with is a message that has come down to them through sources which are authentic. Now I am available for your questions.
Uzma Sahiba, you can unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Zaheer. This is Uzma. Zaheer Saab, I have a statement and then a question. As I'm reading through the Quran currently, I think it's in Surah Baqarah or Surah Al-Imran. I'm not sure which one of the two. That there's an emphasis that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places on the middle prayer. And that middle prayer is the Asr prayer. So just wondering what the significance is of that. So that's just one question. The other one, which is a lecture I attended several months ago that Dr. Shahzad Salim was delivering. And what became, what was a total amazement to me, that there are 3 versions of the Quran that exist in the world currently, and each version is used in different geographical areas. So I'm just wondering why that inconsistency has prevailed and what's the cause behind that. Thank you.
As for your first question, the general understanding is that the middle prayer is the Asr prayer, which is what it was when the Quran was being revealed. If you look at it, it's right in the middle of the day. Fajr and Zuhr come before it, and Maghrib and Isha follow it. And it's a prayer which is said at a time when one is quite busy. It's the climax culmination of the hectic activities, worldly activities of the day coming to an end. And the Almighty is expecting the believer to pray and focus on his remembrance. So obviously the demand is challenging, and the Almighty is mentioning that even though you are required to focus and take seriously all prayers, but more particularly the middle prayer, because this is the one which is going to be the more difficult of the 5 for you to follow. So once you are able to follow and practice Asr prayer, the middle prayer properly, it would actually mean that the other 4 are also going to be done without any difficulty. However, there are some people who believe, and rightly so, that this middle prayer can actually be different for different people. This prayer, the Quran is pointing out, that needs to be taken more seriously, or to be taken as a challenge that should be met properly, could be a prayer for a person who is doing his job in a manner that for him, let's say, the Zohar prayer may turn out to be the most difficult of the 5. For some people, it could be the Fajr prayer. For some, it could be Isha prayer. But generally speaking, it's the Asr prayer where the challenge is more difficult for the believer than the other prayers. As far as the second question is concerned, I did mention in my presentation this morning, well, it's my morning, your evening, that the other texts of God's messages, God's books that came before, got altered, and the Almighty did not intervene, because don't forget that He also has another important consideration to always make sure that it is also met, which is the human liberty has to not be compromised. So people who, for one reason or another, wanted to alter the text of the Almighty's books earlier on, they were allowed to do so, because the Almighty knew that there were more prophets who were going to come, and they are going to get things corrected. But in the case of the last prophet, because there were no further prophets to come, this book was not allowed to be tampered with, and it was promised to be fully preserved. The fact that there are different versions of the Quran to be found in some parts of the Muslim world, well, to be precise, it's something like 3 to 4% population of the Muslim world in North Africa who are making use of a different version, even though they also acknowledge that the version that we have is also God's book. In other words, the text that we believe is the text of the Almighty is accepted, acknowledged by the entire Muslim world as God's word. However, there are cases, rare cases, looking at it in totality, where there are people, because of some historical mistake committed by some rulers, probably in the 2nd century Hijrah, those decisions resulted in the official version of the Quran to be taken as a somewhat different version. It's different in some words, the way they are pronounced. And obviously, there is some difference in meaning, not substantial, but most certainly that difference is there. But for people to be able to know what exactly is the text that the Almighty sent, they also have the version that is extant, practiced, read, and understood all throughout the Muslim world. This obviously is something that the Almighty allowed to happen because human liberty itself is an important consideration to be preserved. But despite this other version, uh, the original version is what we have all throughout the Muslim world. And the scholar that you mentioned, Dr. Shahzad Salimi, he has done a wonderful job in identifying the problem, mentioning the fact that this is a serious problem, and also clarifying that as a consequence of the research efforts that he has undertaken, he has brought forth the conclusion, the reality, that the text that we believe to be God's word is available all throughout the Muslim world, and all Muslims consider that text as God's word, even though in a tiny minority of the Muslim population, there are some people who also consider another version to be equally coming from God.
Thank you, Dr. Zaheer. So there's a question. First of all, if any of you want to unmute your microphone and ask a question, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll start reading the questions that you have put in the chat. So there's a question here that's specific to kids. How should we best explain the difference between Quran and Sunnah to kids?
Okay. If I am imagining that I'm talking to a young man, I'll tell him that, look here, the Quran is a text and the Sunnah is a practice. So the text would explain to you a few things, mention to you certain principles, clarify to you what beliefs are, would give you arguments, would remind you, would tell you that, you've got to take your religion seriously, etc., etc. So a text is like a book. But when it comes to Sunnah, it is actually practice. It's something which is to be done. And that's how it was actually made popular, introduced to the Muslims of the first generation, and that's how it was transmitted to the next generations. So, for example, prayer. Now, the Quran says that you establish prayers, you pray regularly. That's a text, that's an injunction, a requirement. But the prayer itself is a practice, it's a ritual. It was performed by the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him, and the companions, they followed him and emulated him. So obviously, they are two different categories. Sometimes we do get confused when some people insist that our prayer is what we have learned from Hadith, and Hadith is a text. Well, that's not the case. Even though we have the mention of prayers and other sunnahs in Hadith as well, yet the fact of the matter is that we have learned all these practices through our elders. That's how it has been transmitted. One generation, transmitting it, enabling others to learn, and then so on in the next generations. So the basic difference is that one is a text and the other is a practice.
Great, Dr. Zaheer. So as I understand it, the Quran provides the foundation, and then Sunnah is the practical application of what Quran is saying. Is that a correct understanding?
The Quran gives us the basic uh, understanding of what religion is, provides us with foundations of our beliefs, which I'm going to talk about in some of the subsequent presentations. It talks about history, it talks about the importance of following religion. Within the mention of that religion, there are certain religious practices. When you made this clarification, you were also referring to the entire life of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which indeed is a glorious example for us. But that is what is not necessarily Sunnah in its entirety, because this glorious example of the Prophet was witnessed and transmitted by some people. So we look at the Quran and we look at his practices, the way he went about following the Quran. But Sunnah is a completely distinct set of practices that were uh, given to the entire first generation Muslims. All of them came to learn about it. It wasn't that the Prophet practiced a few things and some people noticed them and transmitted to the next generation. All Sunnah practices were observed by all Muslims and then were transmitted to the next generation. So it's like the Quran, a completely independent and fully preserved set of practices, which are also mentioned in Hadith.
Great, thank you so much. So again, if somebody has a question and wants to ask, please unmute your microphone and start asking. Otherwise, I'll start going through the questions that you have sent in the chat. So the next question is about sequencing of surahs in Quran. Is that something that was done by Allah Ta'ala?
Most certainly, I did refer to this particular arrangement. I chose not to go into the details of it, or else it would have consumed a lot more time. The verses 16 to 19 of Surah Al-Qiyamah, which is a very early surah. It was revealed as one of the earliest surahs of the Quran in the Meccan period. It actually mentioned the fact that the Quran is going to be recited, and the Prophet is going to emulate that recitation, that practice of reciting. It was Jibril, the angel Jibril alayhi salam, who read the Quran, and he did it every Ramadan in Medina during I'tikaf of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet used to follow him. In the last Ramadan, when the entire Quran was completed, its revelation was completely done, this practice was done twice. That is, Faiza Qaranahu, when we recite it, Fattabi Qurana, you follow us in reciting. This sequence is a completely different sequence from what it was originally when it was revealed historically. So the answer is yes, it's absolutely what the Almighty Himself said, Himself required and desired, and it's a sequence which the entire Muslim world agrees to as the only valid, officially acceptable sequence. There is no other sequence in the Quran that is presented by Muslims as the Quran or Quranic sequence.
Okay. So now I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. They're both regarding Sunnah. So maybe you can provide a more comprehensive answer. So first of all, if not Hadith, then what's the source of Sunnah? I think you have explained this well, but maybe you can clarify a little bit. But also, is Sunnah something that goes beyond Prophet Muhammad? So the person is asking if other prophets followed Sunnah too.
All prophets followed Sunnah. The Almighty is asking Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I mentioned this verse 123 of Surah 16, Surah Nahl, that you follow the religion of Abraham. Ibrahim alayhi salam and all other prophets prayed, and the Quran is actually giving evidence of it. And this prayer has been given to us by the Prophet. Obviously, even before the Prophet came, declared that he has begun to receive revelation, some people in Mecca were praying because they were the progeny of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salam. That prayer was different. Why? Because obviously changes do take place if it's not fully and completely preserved. But the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, he introduced the very same prayer with obviously some changes, some new elements added, because obviously now we read the Quran in our prayers. It's said in Arabic, but by and large, the entire structure is the same. So it's the same religion that was practiced by all previous prophets and their followers. We don't claim that we are follower of a new, distinct religion. We are the follower of the same religion. We claim that we were not, it's not just that we are Muslims. All earlier prophets and their followers were likewise Muslims. As far as the other question is concerned, just imagine, how did you learn your prayer? How did you start praying? Obviously, but not by looking at books of hadith. You started praying by looking at your parents, your elders, people in the mosque who were praying. Likewise, it has happened for almost all Muslims. So we learn our religious practices from the way they are happening around us. And that really has been the case right from the first generation. It's another matter that what was happening during those times was also noticed, observed by some people, not all, a few people, who then informed some individuals of the next generation, who then informed about this reality, this fact, some people in the subsequent generation. So after 4 or 5 generations, there were people who started putting them down in the form of books after having investigated as to whether the narrators were reliable or not. So they put down in books what was being done, what was happening. We don't read those books to go for those practices. Indeed, we refer to them, we read them sometimes to find out as to whether some of the details that we are going through are correct or not. But Sunnah, the nature of it is such that we don't read a book and practice. We look at the people who are doing it already and we follow and emulate them.
So that begs the question, Dr. Zaheer, that, as you stated, that other prophets were also Muslims, right? And Sunnah is something that we learned from our surroundings, our parents, our community. Then, in Christianity, the concept of Trinity, a person who's born into Christianity, they learn the concept of Trinity from their surroundings. And so how can we be sure that the Sunnah that we're following is actually accurate and not, it's not something that's been tampered with?
That's exactly what I was trying to explain, that the Sunnah that we are following is the religious practice that is being observed all throughout the Muslim world. This Sunnah is what has actually been required in the Quran to be followed. So the two texts, they go hand in hand. In the case of Trinity, what you find is that the history of Trinity itself can be traced back to the time when it all started. We can see from the earlier books, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that God even in those books, is making it very clear that he is the one and the only. He is the one who needs to be worshipped. In other words, you can actually see as to when things started changing. You can observe it that it was not Jesus Christ, may peace be upon him, who gave the understanding of Trinity. You can find that changes started taking place only when he left this world, and we had other people who took over. So obviously, when we will talk to a Christian friend, we will ask him to look at his tradition with an open mind and find out as to whether this concept of Trinity was actually presented by Jesus Christ himself, or is it that it was added later by some people? Was it Saint Paul who started introducing things which were different from what Jesus Christ stood for? So, we will tell them that let's move out of this tradition and look at it from from an objective point of view as to whether what Christians of today are doing, is it that Jesus Christ presented to them, or what is happening now is somewhat different. So obviously this discussion debate is going to happen, and it should be done politely, it should be done academically, and obviously one should be very honest in understanding what the facts are and coming to the conclusions that those facts are leading to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but just to make sure that I understand this correctly, that if there is any kind of a tampering, you can go back in time and pinpoint and say that, okay, this is something that was not instantiated by Prophet himself or Jesus. It was, later on, somebody changed it. History provides us the evidence that somebody changed it. Is that a correct
That's right.
understanding? Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, everybody. So we're out of time for tonight, but inshallah, we'll see you all next week. Jazakallah. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you,
Zaheer.
Bhatt. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.